It's starting to be a really troubling year, 1956, and not only in Europe, but as we know, in the Middle East. Nobody at that time, you probably remember, trusted the Russians. They really didn't. The Russians were really, of course, trying to make more inroads into parts of the West, certainly. So, please sit down. There you go. Okay, so the Middle East, though, was beginning to erupt. I'm just going to summarize briefly what we went through last week, okay?
Go ahead.
I will.
Well, I was here last week.
Go ahead. Okay, we talked about the nuclear age. At least three countries had atomic bombs. We also looked at, hello Don, the history of the Suez Canal and how it was dug. And way back in 1858. We also looked at the history of Hungary. And we saw what a complex country that was. Then we examined Britain's diminishing empire at the end of World War II, of course. That started to really fall apart. And Egypt, which had been occupied by the British for many years, wanted to become an independent country. They truly wanted to grow as an independent country. And in the United States, Eisenhower was the president. He was getting towards his last year of the first term. So that becomes an important point. And of course, in Russia, Khrushchev was in power. Now, Colonel Nasser, we talked about, was leading Egypt. And Nasser really wanted to bring Egypt up, to try and give people work and to make them more of an industrial power. Well, Israel is seeing this, and they're getting very worried because he's buying arms and starting to become a threat. In Britain, Churchill retired and Anthony Eden takes over as Prime Minister. Remember, Eden was a little sick as well. He suffered a gallbladder operation that went wrong. And he had that for the rest of his life, a real problem. And then, towards the end of last week, Nasser nationalizes the Suez Canal. Well, he also, by nationalizing it, he stops Israel using it. And he threatens Israeli shipping coming out of the Gulf of Aqaba. So things are beginning to rise. And don't forget, Eden personally hates Nasser. He really believes he's the new Hitler. So, any questions before we go forward? All right. Let's see. Well, there it is, October 56 and the first week of November. That's the period of time that we'll be focusing upon. Just a mere 4 weeks. Now, during this time period, we're going to be moving backwards and forwards between Europe and also the Suez Canal. So, moving on. Why did NASA nationalize the Suez Canal? Well, he said he did it so that he could finance the Aswan Dam. He felt he could use the dues to finance the dam, and he actually announced that. However, recently, many believe the reason he did it was retaliation to the West, really for withdrawing the financing for the Aswan Dam. He wanted to get back at the West. He saw the building of the dam as a reason to solve all of Egypt's problems, and NASA would be the leader who made that happen. So, well, back in Britain, Eden said, "This is a hostile act. It's theft." He began secretly planning with France to take back the canal. And he contacted Eisenhower to give support for a forceful response. Well, Eisenhower objected to the use of force, as he should have done. However, secretly, Britain started planning what they called Operation Musketeer. Well, Operation Musketeer required the British military services to prepare for it, the Navy, the Army, and the Air Force. And they said to Eden, "We need 3 months to get ready for this. We can't do it tomorrow." The United States objected to the use of force. So, within the UK, there were divisions. In fact, the leader of the opposition warned that the UK would be denounced by the UN Security Council as aggressors. Well, Eden then began to secretly continue the plan with France, and he made that decision on July the 29th, 1956, knowing full well that his military needed 3 months. Well, August, September, October, you see what we're leading to. All right. Now, John Foster Dulles from the States came over, and Dulles gave the impression to Eden that the US would back him. But Dulles brought with him a letter from Eisenhower that specifically said the use of force is unacceptable. So Eden was getting a little bit of a mixed message. Dulles saying, okay, NASA needs to be put down. And Eisenhower saying no. So, any questions? Yes.
Eden calls it a hostile act.
Yes,
Against who? Against
Britain.
the world?
Britain was in charge of it, you see. So when he nationalizes it,
Okay,
it takes away anything to do with a foreign power.
okay, because Britain didn't recognize Nasser as the leader of Egypt.
Oh yeah, he was,
But it was his,
he was,
was it not
I mean,
his
he
choice?
was allowed to probably to do that, but Eden didn't see it that way. He said, you can't do that. It's British. Yes, sir.
Yeah, one observation. So Mr. Nasser, the president now, is his title president?
He's now president, yes.
President Nasser was saying, well, that water goes through, that canal goes through
My country.
Egypt. And the last time I looked, that's ours.
I know.
So maybe
I
we
know.
can negotiate terms, but it's certainly ours.
But by nationalizing it, it gave him the option in the future to stop any ship,
Yes.
which is important. He'd already stopped Israeli ships. Any other questions?
Just one comment. My understanding, I believe, from last week's lecture is that in your timeline, the British troops basically left Egypt June 18th. So Britain and France and Nasser are all doing this probably within less than a month.
Well, they needed to get more than, the troops had to sail there.
No, but I understand that the nationalization of the canal
Yes.
occurred slightly less than a month
That's right.
after. Okay.
Exactly. Okay, moving forward. Now for the UK, the cost of the actual Suez crisis wasn't so much a political one as a financial crisis. I mean, Britain required record levels of borrowing. This particular chart shows the International Monetary Fund borrowing by various things through that time period, as you can see. And you can see here is 56. Britain was getting into trouble and needing money from the IMF, and again here, and again here. So it went on and on, borrowing money from the IMF, but they wouldn't release the money until Britain backed off. And that's what was the problem. So you can see Eden's in an awkward position. So just before the closure of the canal, which takes place in the third week in October, Britain's golden dollar reserves were just over $2 billion. Precipitously, within a month, they dropped to $1.5 billion. This was serious. Britain was approaching bankruptcy. And this concerned Harold Macmillan, who was the Chancellor of the Exchequer. And he suggested to Eden, please, please do not invade Egypt, because if you do, you're going to have a real problem. Okay. With pressure from the United States, a meeting took place in 10 Downing Street on August the 1st, 1956, between Britain, France, and the USA to try and resolve the crisis. Eden was cautioned to follow a UN charter to hold off on an invasion. Secretly, he was still going forward. The Australian Prime Minister, Robert Menzies, flew into Cairo to meet with Nasser and present a UN plan to resolve the stalemate. But actually NASA rejected the UN plan. NASA said, I don't need the UN here, it's our country. So, go forward 3 months, right? Britain are getting all their ships ready, they're getting troops on there. On October the 5th, Britain and France take their case to the Security Council of the UN, and they discuss it. But there is no resolution and no vote at this stage. Okay? They're just discussing it. 2 weeks later, on October the 14th, Eden and the Secretary of State for Foreign Affairs in Britain, Anthony Nutting, secretly meet with 2 French emissaries, Albert Gazier and Maurice Chalet, and they meet out at Eden's country house, Chequers, in Buckinghamshire, in Britain. It's all secret. And the French say, look, we've got a plan. How about we get Israel to invade Egypt through the Sinai, and that Britain and France step in to separate the combatants and then occupy the canal. Oh, what a lovely idea, thinks Eden. This picture shows the plan in detail. You'll see the basics of the plan is that Israel should actually invade across here. You'll notice up here is the Gaza Strip, still part of Egypt, okay? Now, within 10 miles of the Suez Canal, the Israelis stop, okay? This is the plan. The British and the French come into Port Said as paratroopers, commandos, etc. The Israeli paratroopers come down at the bottom here near Suez at Militia Pass. The Egyptian blockade is down the bottom here, just off the coast of Sharm el-Sheikh. They're stopping ships from Israel, leaving Eilat and coming down and stopping here. They can't go through. Egypt's blocking them with guns. So, at this stage, as I mentioned, that Gaza Strip, still part of Egypt. Any questions? Okay. Now that Nasser has nationalized the canal, obviously he can at any time close it to all shipping, not just Israeli shipping. We know that. And for Britain, it would be much more difficult to stay in touch with its empire, even though it was shrinking, and more expensive to ship oil all the way round the Cape, remember? For France, they had similar concerns. But in addition, they blamed Nasser for financing the Algerian rebels. For Israel, they needed the canal opened to their ships, and they were worried about the build-up of the Soviet weapons that were now in Egypt. Okay. Let's look at the forces facing each other. For Britain and France, yeah, they had well-trained, experienced troops. However, post-war austerity had led to cutbacks. There were a lot of cutbacks. Britain was also involved in trying to keep order in other places, like Cyprus, for example. And France was really involved in Algeria. Now, Israel's military was led by Moshe Dayan, and they had the best military in the Middle East, no doubt about it. Now, Egypt's military was effective, but they suffered from poor leadership because it was really political rather than military leadership. Nasser put in his friends. So, moving forward, this was a very important document. And I've got a handout of this, the Sèvres Protocol. This is an English translation because the original was written in French. Could you pass it down? Thank you. There it is. It's okay. If you've got extra, just leave them to one side.
What's the definition of nationalization?
It's when it belongs to the country. They nationalize it. They take it over. The government runs it. It happened in Britain quite a lot. They nationalized the railways, for example. And the railways were 4 different private companies. They turn around and say, we're going to nationalize it. It's socialism as the extreme.
Whereas before the nationalization.
Before the nationalization, it was British.
Okay.
And he did offer to pay them off, the shareholders, but Britain rejected that. Okay, let's talk about the Sèvres Protocol. Now, there was a highly secret meeting that was held from October the 22nd to the 24th, 1956, in the town of Sèvres, which is just south of Paris. The purpose of the meeting was to topple Nasser and occupy the Canal Zone. Those present from Israel, Moshe Dayan, David Ben-Gurion, and Shimon Peres, top leaders in Israel. For France, the Minister of Defense, the Prime Minister, Guy Mollet, and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Christian Pinault. From Britain, Selwyn Lloyd, who was the Foreign Secretary, Patrick Dean, who was the assistant to Selwyn Lloyd. And all secretly agreed that Israel would attack Egypt in the Sinai Peninsula on October the 29th and advance towards the Canal Zone. And then on October the 30th, Britain and France would intervene militarily to separate the warring forces 10 miles from the canal and then occupy the Canal Zone. This was all secret. Okay. Any questions? Now, although it was kept secret, Eden did have to tell some of his senior ministers, Edward Heath, Harold Macmillan, Rab Butler. But others that were aware were Lord Salisbury, Anthony Head, and a gentleman called, you remember, Anthony Nutting. And Anthony Nutting wrote a memoir called No End of a Lesson in 1967 and explained it all and exposed the whole thing. Eisenhower was totally kept in the dark. Now, Nutting said to Eden at this time, the US and world opinion are not going to support Britain and France for this. And then he resigned. This secrecy, though, also put Britain's military in a very dangerous position because they thought they were simply invading Egypt. They knew nothing about this secret plan. Now, if you're a military guy, you're going to be really upset. Now, it's highly likely through the CIA, etc., that the US probably learned about the Sèvres Protocol, but they didn't say anything. They kept quiet. And this whole plan really upset the Russians with the Cold War because they had spies also, particularly in the British government. So, moving right on. Yes, sir.
I have a question. I think I misheard you. In one of those preliminary meetings, Severus, did you say there was no U.S. representation?
No. They didn't know about it.
Did you say there was any State Department so the United States at this point is completely out?
At least they weren't involved in that at all.
Possibly the CIA.
I bet you they knew about it.
Probably.
I would hope so. I mean, if you've got a good spy organization, you should know.
Eisenhower does not know.
I doubt it somehow, because he would have erupted. Now, exactly the same time of the Sèvres Protocol was conceived, a number of East European countries particularly wanted independence, as you can see here, from Russia, particularly Poland at this stage, wanted to move away and have their own government. This was important. So a lot of Warsaw Pact countries were beginning to think, we want to be independent and not part of the Warsaw Pact. In fact, in Poland, they were under the control of Władysław Gomułka. You'll remember, Mr. Gomułka was the Prime Minister of Poland, and they were pushing for their own political party, independent, and there were riots in Poland about this, and they were well publicized throughout Europe. Well, seeing those riots in Poland inspired students in Budapest, Hungary, to rebuff the cruel Soviet presence. And on October the 23rd, the same day as the Sevres Protocol was being discussed, 300,000 students protested in Budapest. And Erno Guerrero steps down as party leader. Well, the state police in Hungary starts to arrest some of the students. And they tried to disperse the crowd with tear gas. Well, when you see your friends being arrested by the state police, you try and free them. Oh dear, the police opened fire. And in fact, that started the Hungarian Revolution in 1956, October 23. Not good. Well, in Russia, seeing what was happening, they send in Soviet tanks to quell the demonstration. And Khrushchev said, America did this, which they didn't. But Khrushchev was good at blaming other people. Protesters in Budapest tear down the statue of Stalin, rip it off its pedestal. All that was left was a pair of boots. Down it came. Well, that was on October 24th. Soviet troops opened fire on the demonstrators. And at this stage, the Hungarian police are on the demonstrators' side. This is turning into a revolution. Imre Nagy takes over again as the Hungarian leader. Chaos descends. 20 Soviet soldiers and 80 Hungarian demonstrators are killed in the rioting, and it spreads outside of Budapest to other cities. Overnight, Soviet forces now occupy much of Budapest, but rioting is still taking place. And as the revolution spread throughout the country, the Central Committee of Russia met on October the 25th and agreed that Yanis Kadar, a loyal communist, should be made party leader and shift Imre Nagy to a side position. Well, the protesters in Hungary organized a march in the center of Budapest. It culminates in Kossuth Square. Anybody that's been to Budapest will know. Kossuth Square is where the parliamentary buildings are. The Soviets had lined up their tanks in front of the Parliament building. And as the march entered Kossuth Square, they opened fire on hundreds of protesters. Hungary wanted help from other countries. The US hesitates to intervene. They said it was a local problem. Eisenhower, however, wants the United Nations to be involved, but no avail. On October the 27th, John Foster Dulles contacts the Soviets to let them know the USA will not interfere. This was an important point. Russia knew they could do what they wanted. Now, that same day, October 27th, in London, Eden's legal team advised him there is absolutely no justification for Britain to invade Egypt. Eden ignores their advice. And the military is saying, are you really sure this is what we should be doing? He ignores it. He goes ahead and he orders the Royal Navy to leave Malta on a training exercise. Well, a French warship delivers both arms and fighter jets to Israel. This is now called Operation Musketeer, and it's considered top secret. 3 NATO allies, Britain, France, and the USA, they're in a poker game and everybody's bluffing. Nobody is showing their hand. So, the next day, October 28th, Israel mobilizes and starts Operation Kadesh. It's an effort to reopen the Straits of Tiran and Aqaba. Well, the following day, October 29th, Eisenhower warns Ben-Gurion to back off any aggression. He mistakenly believes that Israel is going to attack Jordan. Well, Israel now moved their army into the Negev desert in the Sinai towards the Egyptian border and also, of course, the Gaza Peninsula. So they move into the Gaza Strip. And 4 Israeli fighters fly extremely low over the Sinai Peninsula. They're cutting all the telephone lines with very sharp blades underneath the aircraft.
That's right, I remember that.
There you go. They just cut them. That's why these guys are saying, great.
Could you explain that? What kind of
50 feet.
I forget that, but I mean, what was the tool you say? It was some sort of blade or something?
Yeah, a blade.
Wow.
Isn't that something?
Yeah.
Well, that stops communication from the Sinai to Cairo. So the Egyptians aren't sure what's going on, but they're a little worried. This map shows the situation. The Egyptian army is very confused at this stage. They've heard a few reports that Israeli troops are there and moving towards the Suez Canal. And Israel, as a deception tactic, have a curfew order issued on the Israeli-Jordan border here. They put a curfew on this border. There's Jordan, there's Israel. Well, that curfew order results in a number of Palestinian Arabs are actually killed by Israeli border guards. And you can understand why now Eisenhower thought they were attacking Jordan. Israeli paratroopers are dropped down on the militia pass down here. That's where the paratroopers from Israel are dropped. Also up here, sorry. This is very sensitive. This little thing flicks me through. Now, the French dropped supplies to the Israelis on the ground. It's now clear to Egypt they're under attack by Israel, and the United States at this point makes the same assumption. Okay, it's now October 29th. In Hungary, all this is happening at the same time in Egypt. The Soviets appear now to be withdrawing their forces from Budapest. And the Hungarians believe that their protests have brought about the changes they wanted. Unfortunately, this is a false hope. The Soviets go back to the border between Hungary and Russia and regroup. Khrushchev meets with Mao in China, and Mao says to Khrushchev, look, withdraw your troops completely, please. We don't need this. Well, then Imre Nagy in Budapest announces that Hungary should be democratic and that Russia should leave for good. Oh dear. The next day, October the 30th, protesters in Budapest attack the state security police, who are Russians. And there's a headquarters in Budapest. And these demonstrators attack it and they kill 20 of the Russian police. Oh, Khrushchev and Mao, on receiving this news, have a real change of heart. So, the next day, October 31st, Soviet troops have vanished from the streets. They're still waiting by the border. And the protesters are driving the Russian tanks in a celebratory parade through Budapest. They'd captured these tanks. American diplomats in Hungary report that all is peaceful. Everybody's happy. Imre Nagy makes a controversial decision to have Hungary withdraw from the Warsaw Pact. Oh dear, and become a neutral nation. He then asks the United Nations to become involved with his dispute with the Soviet Union. Well, back to the Middle East again on Tuesday, October the 30th. At 4 p.m., Britain and France issue an ultimatum to both Egypt and Israel to cease fighting and withdraw within 10 miles of the canal within 12 hours. This, of course, is the Sèvres plan. Additionally, Egypt has to accept what they call a temporary occupation of the canal by British and French troops. Now, neither the United Nations or the USA were consulted on this ultimatum, and it provoked outrage worldwide. For the Soviets, this was actually a blessing in disguise. because basically what happens is that the Soviets now are not the only villain on the stage. Eisenhower is furious. He orders Israel as the aggressor to withdraw its troops immediately, and he does that through the UN Security Council. He also rebukes Britain and France over the deceit and tables a resolution with the UN Security Council. Now, remember, in the UN, you have two ways of voting, on the Security Council and on the General Assembly. Now, if you vote on the Security Council, there are a limited number of countries involved, and it has to be unanimous. So any one country can veto in the Security Council. Well, a vote takes place on the Security Council and the resolution fails because Britain and France vote against the resolution. This is the first time that has ever happened by Britain and France. Usually it's Russia that vetoes, but this was the first time. Any questions? Okay, it's now the end of October, and in the Sinai, Israeli meteor jets are fighting off the remains of the Egyptian Air Force. Hardly any is left. However, an Egyptian destroyer shells the Israeli port of Haifa up here. Well, a French warship comes onto the scene and shoots at the Egyptian destroyer, and they capture it, and the Israelis escort it into Haifa. So they've captured one of NASA's destroyers. The British and the French ultimatum have now expired, and the British and French fleets are very close to landing in Egypt. The US Sixth Fleet is put on standby in the Mediterranean. Eden assumes the people of Britain support him, but the Labour leader, Hugh Gaitskell, tells Eden that this is a disastrous folly. He then adds, the whole business is an act of collusion between Britain, France, and Israel. The secret is out. They now know about it. Any questions? That evening, British warplanes attack Cairo, and NASA responds by sinking 40 ships in the canal, effectively closing it. You can't use the canal now. You cannot get to it. It's blocked. The attack by Britain on Cairo by the Air Force is a disaster. Instead of hitting the Egyptian military airfield at Al-Mazar, the British bombers mistakenly bombed Cairo airport. Oh my God! That causes significant damage, and the US is furious. Israeli and French ships bombard Egyptian bases in Rafah on the Gaza Strip. Let's just go back for a moment There's Rafah. There's the Gaza Strip. It's now in Egypt, in Israel, temporarily. Okay. This is the beginning, of course, of Israel's capture of the Gaza Strip, but it's only temporary. The early morning of November the 1st, 1956, British newspapers say, the canal stays blocked. The British continue bombing Egypt's military airfields, and they knock out pretty well the whole lot of the Egyptian military air cover. And NASA retaliates, demanding the British leave Egypt, and until they do, the canal stays blocked. Now, you'll notice on this headline, happening the same day. Okay? Yes.
I think humorously, in the same page, it says the British protest Moscow for what's going on. Only the British have the chutzpah to do that.
Exactly. I mean, it's like almost you could make it into a laughable situation, but people are being killed in this. This is serious. It's now November 1. This is a picture taken from the air of Port Said. Okay? There's Port Said, the entrance to the Suez Canal. Now, British bombers continue the assault on the Egyptian Air Force, and they start to drop paratroopers into Port Said. However, other Arab nations start to cut off oil supplies to the west as demonstrations take place throughout their countries, demanding a ceasefire. The US takes this matter to the United Nations General Assembly, not the Security Council, the General Assembly. The resolution passes that Britain should move out 64 to 5. The 5 are Britain, France, Israel, Australia, and New Zealand. There it is. Well, on November the 2nd, the Israelis have captured the entire Gaza Strip. Okay? Plus Gaza itself, with dozens of non-combatants killed during this time. And the Egyptian forces are now starting to come back into Cairo over here. So, Lord Louis Mountbatten, he's the chief of the Royal Navy at this stage, he offers Eden his resignation, but actually Eden refuses it. Anthony Nutting, as we've said, has resigned from the Foreign Office. And I've mentioned, I'll give you a bibliography at the end here. Anthony Nutting's book is on that. So you'll have the information to read that book, which is really quite interesting. That's an Egyptian tank in trouble in that picture. Now, in the Mediterranean, the British and French convoys, they're almost at Port Said. Don't forget, the paratroopers have been dropped. But they're a little behind schedule, much to the irritation of Israel. In Gaza, Israel executes a number of Palestinians who oppose them in the Gaza Strip. The Secretary General of the United Nations, this stage Dag Hammarskjöld, you'll remember, announces that Egypt will agree to a ceasefire if Israel stops. He calls on Israel to agree also to a ceasefire and demands that British and French ships should turn around. He's ignored. Foster Dulles, the US Secretary of State, is admitted to hospital with a cancer diagnosis. He was obviously a sick man. And while that's happening in the Middle East, on Sunday, November the 4th, Khrushchev, irritated by the attacks in Budapest on the Russian security police, has a complete change of heart and launches what he calls Operation Whirlwind. And he's going to retake Hungary by force. He convinces all the the Warsaw Pact countries, except Poland, that an occupation of Hungary is very appropriate. Soviet tanks, led by Marshal Zhukov, cross the border again. They capture Hungary's airfields, bridges, highway junctions, putting an end to any opposition. This time the Soviets come into Budapest and arrest all the military leaders and the politicians. The Hungarian military, without any leadership, starts to fall apart and dissolve. Valiant rebels put up barricades in the streets and the tanks just mow them away. The United Nations Security Council meets in New York and condemns Russia, but the council vote is vetoed by the Soviets. That's the problem. Soviet troops now occupy the whole of Hungary. The Hungarian leader, Imre Nagy, insists, please don't shoot Russian troops. And then he leaves parliament and seeks asylum in the Yugoslav embassy. János Kádár, a Soviet stooge, becomes the leader of Hungary. Refugees from Hungary are fleeing to Austria, to Yugoslavia, since this is a war of total conquest. And it's all over by November the 11th. 20,000 Hungarians are killed. 20,000. And over 100,000 arrested by the Soviets. This is the end of Hungary. Back in the Middle East on November the 4th, Israeli ambassador at the United Nations, Abba Eban, offers a complete ceasefire so long as Egypt does the same. Well, of course, by this time, Israel has achieved its objectives. The justification also for an Anglo-French intervention has now evaporated. Well, this picture shows an Israeli soldier next to a captured Egyptian gun on the Gulf of Aqaba, not far from Sharm el-Sheikh. The Straits of Tiran are now open to Israeli shipping. Obviously not the canal, but then nobody can go through the canal. Britain's in a crisis. One has to remember, though, that during the 1940s and the 1950s, the British public is very poorly informed. And part of the problem is something called the 14-day rule. And that is that anything that is about to be discussed in Parliament during the next 14 days is off limits to the news media. It's called censorship. And that includes the BBC. However, there is one newspaper, the Sunday Observer newspaper, on November the 4th, fights the 14-day rule. And they label the government of Britain as gangsters. They also call for the dismissal of Anthony Eden and encourage the population to take part in street demonstrations. Well, they do. And on November the 4th, 20,000 people in Britain attend this very large demonstration in Trafalgar Square. And it criticizes the government for using force in the Middle East. And the demonstrators then march on 10 Downing Street. Police on horses are swept into this. And of course, a number of people are injured by the horses and the police with truncheons. Eventually, the police regain control. Now, even though Eden is upset by the demonstrators, he went ahead with his plans with the support of his cabinet. The leader of the opposition, Hugh Gateskill, called on Eden to resign. Ignores it. In the United Nations, Lester Pearson, the Canadian Foreign Minister, suggests a peacekeeping force to be sent to Egypt, and a vote on the resolution in the UN passes 57-4. Well, guess who abstained? Britain, France, Israel, and Egypt. They didn't want people in their country. The Secretary General, Dag Hammarskjöld, sets a deadline for the ceasing of hostilities. But Britain and France ignore the deadline and continue bombing Port Said. And they also start to land commandos and Marines into Port Said. There's the headlines on the newspapers on November the 5th. They start landing. At this stage, Britain's dollar reserves are dangerously low. And there's a shortage of oil because of the blocked Suez Canal. In Russia, Marshal Bulganin threatens Britain and France with a retaliatory strike because of the invasion of Port Said. Well, many in the West see this as a prelude to World War III. Of course, at the same time, Russia is suppressing Hungary. It's clear now, the next day, that the run on sterling could only be checked by Britain agreeing to a ceasefire. France doesn't want to stop, since both are positioned at the northern end of the canal, their objective. Britain's Chancellor of the Exchequer, Harold Macmillan, meets with Eden and explains the problem with Sterling now being under attack. And he tells the complete cabinet, this is a dire circumstance. Britain is becoming bankrupt. Reluctantly, Eden orders a ceasefire at midnight on November the 6th in the House of Commons. Well, the military cannot believe this. They've not been told. We thought we were attacking and occupying the canal. Total disbelief. Following the ceasefire, British troops are ordered to leave Egypt within 30 days. Well, that will be December the 5th. Any questions?
Who ordered them to leave?
The UN. And Britain. Eden's cabinet. Because he agreed to a ceasefire. Well, Dag Hammarskjöld then announces that since Britain and France have agreed, we'll send in an emergency peacekeeping force which will police the Suez Canal. Well, that peacekeeping force have got people from Colombia, Denmark, Norway, Sweden, even India, Indonesia, Brazil, a whole mishmash of people who are the peacekeeping force. Now, in the United States, it's election day. Well, Eisenhower is elected by a landslide for a second term. Eden contacts Eisenhower, congratulates him, and said, I'd like to meet with you. And Eisenhower says, no way, I'm not meeting with you. No way. 51 ships now block the Suez Canal, and 1,000 Egyptians are killed. 23 Allied personnel were killed. That's all. On November the 21st, Eden, who is now quite ill, decides to leave Britain to recuperate. He flies off to Jamaica and he stays at Ian Fleming's house, which is called Goldeneye in Jamaica. Petrol rationing is imposed on everybody in Britain due to the lack of oil. And on December the 3rd, on target, Britain starts to withdraw its troops. Well, 3 weeks later, on December the 17th, Eden, with his wife, returns to Britain. He goes straight to the House of Commons, and before a crowded chamber, he denies everything, any foreknowledge of Israel invading Egypt. He also says he will never apologize, and many MPs boo him. And on January the 9th, he resigns from the government, and Harold Macmillan takes over as Prime Minister. 20 years later, in 1977, Eden dies a broken man. He was the last Prime Minister to believe that Britain was a great power, and the first to confront a crisis which proved she was not. So, the pressure on Sterling forces Britain to get its troops out, and the last troops leave Egypt just before Christmas in 56. Quite the opposite of what Eden intended. Now, Israel left the Gaza Strip in March 57, the following year. So it's back to Egypt again. And by the following month, the Suez Canal is opened again. They cleared the ships. The Suez War had been brief but very messy. It cost Britain substantial loss of prestige worldwide, and it was very clear that Britain was no longer an important power. And the Suez Crisis also was a disaster for the Arab-Israel peace situation. This cartoon sums it up beautifully. It came out on November the 28th, and it was in Punch, and it sums it up perfectly. Here you have Selwyn Lloyd, and here Pinot, and here Ben Gurion as naughty schoolboys. And in the United Nations is Dag Hammarskjöld, and they're writing out, "I must not bully." And watching over them is a grinning NASA, and in the background, in the background is Khrushchev with his hand on Hungary. It's a lovely cartoon. Yeah.
Yeah, I forget. So the Brits and French have gone home, packed their bags. The Israelis still stay in Sinai, is that correct? The Israeli army is still in Sinai?
No, they come out.
part of the
They
Kuwait
come
borders.
out.
So
Then
go
they
back
come
to
out of Gaza, the Gaza
Kuwait
Strip.
borders.
Yep.
Okay.
Eventually,
Gaza.
eventually they come out. Yeah.
So they're not
They
showing-
don't want to stay there anyway. Let's be honest, there's nothing there.
Well, of course. Well, yeah. I mean, I guess.
But it's a buffer state, really.
The Gulf of.
Aqaba.
So,
No, that's
Sorry.
down further.
I mean, so they
It's
get-
true.
they have Sharm el-Sheikh and everything. Okay.
That's right. They've moved out. So, had the Suez invasion not interrupted the Hungarian rebellion, paralyzing NATO and the UN, the Hungarian rebels might have received outside help. Then more rebellions in the Eastern Bloc, in Poland, etc., might have been inspired. As it was, nothing changed. Imre Nagy was arrested on November the 23rd, sent for trial, found guilty, and hanged by the Soviets the following year. We need to ask ourselves some of these questions. Did Britain's attack on Egypt give the Soviets the opportunity to attack Hungary? Maybe. Did the United Nations' behavior over Britain's invasion of Egypt affect the way it treated Russia? Revolt in Hungary was met with vicious repression. Perhaps the UN should have acted. Was the USA worried that any confrontation with Russia would have invoked a military response? The USA did nothing, but maybe had they done something, it might have been very serious. By the end of '56, the Suez Canal was still closed under Egypt's control. And of course, that did get cleared the following April. But still under Egypt's control. So the winner really was NASA. The Algerian rebellion against France was still increasing. So Nasser was still president of Egypt, and in fact considered the leader of the Arab world. Britain was expelled from Egypt and the Canal Zone. The Soviets remained in Hungary for another 34 years. 34 years. And they finally left in June 91. Britain was no longer an independent world power. Nasser finally died from a heart attack in 1970. So, a pretty mess. That's an English expression for chaos. The Suez Crisis has shown that Britain couldn't act independently of an American ally. It also showed the futility of clinging to the illusions of empire, and showed the futility to those in power to practice deceit, a turning point for Britain as regards overseas responsibility. In other words, a true pretty mess.